The coronavirus is bringing radical changes to humanity. It has already brought severe consequences to the global economy. Stock markets around the world are in freefall, and millions of people could lose their jobs as the pandemic will undoubtedly lead to a global recession. Governments are printing money to save economies, and that could result in a very high level of inflation as purchasing power of paper money will go down. Some countries might even face food shortages as borders are closed and the level of trade and production falls significantly. The world order we knew is coming to an end, and at this point nobody can predict what will be the final outcome, except maybe those that predicted the coronavirus pandemic. I'm your host Kasim, and thanks for joining me for this special KJ vid. In this video we will discuss the coronavirus pandemic. Just before we start, please don't forget to visit our website kjvids.co.uk, where we will be uploading fresh perspectives of the coronavirus and its impact on the globe. On November the 18th, 2019, 2 months before the first illness from the coronavirus was actually reported in Wuhan, China, representatives of major international banks, the United Nations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Johnson & Johnson, logistical powerhouses, the media, as well as officials from China and America held a pandemic simulation exercise in New York City. It was called Event 201 and was hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Their simulation includes news reports that were fabricated just for this exercise, and they were very similar to reports that we can now see during the real-world coronavirus outbreak. Some analysts and the so-called conspiracy theorists already speculate that Bill Gates and the company knew about the coronavirus and that what humanity is experiencing today is staged and planned. Whether this is correct or not, most segments of the Event 201 exercise and discussion came true, and some are likely to happen in the near future. Governments around the world have already declared a state of emergency, police and army are on the streets, and millions of people live under self-quarantine, which reminds one of a house arrest. Authorities are assuring that such measures are necessary in order to prevent the spread of the virus. However, it is worth noting that in spite of the pandemic, the US military plans to hold its biggest military exercise in Europe in 25 years. Some 20,000 US troops were slated to deploy to Europe and back this spring for the Defender Europe 20 exercise, which was to last through May and take place in 10 European countries. The US European Command said that due to the coronavirus, they might scale back, but cannot cancel the exercise. In other words, the Pentagon will just reduce the number of American participants in Defender Europe 20, but the show must go on in spite of the fact that European borders are closed and travel restrictions came into force. The coronavirus was a perfect test for all countries. It has provided an opportunity to governments to show how efficient they are. Even though many Western authors and politicians criticize the Chinese authorities for taking radical measures by closing Wuhan and many other cities, such actions resulted in a significant decline of the number of reported infected cases. China might be the first country to win the battle against COVID-19 unless the Event 201 prediction comes true and the pandemic erupts again, which will result in 65 million deaths in the next 18 months. Unlike China, the European Union showed that it is not capable to cope with the crisis. It was China rather than European countries that sent medical assistance to Italy, which has been heavily hit by the coronavirus and now has the largest number of deaths in the world. Even though the Shenzhen Agreement allows free movement of people throughout each of the member countries, the coronavirus has demonstrated that the EU member states are closing their borders and European solidarity virtually does not exist. In fact, it is questionable if the European Union still exists, since countries are forced to cope with this global problem on their own. The COVID-19 pandemic also showed many weaknesses of the current global system. At this point, this pandemic could be interpreted as the end of globalization, or at least the end of the current world order. As author Thomas Wright points out, the crisis seems all but certain to reinforce and deepen trends towards decoupling and deglobalization. Since borders are closed, trade is limited and level of production is reduced, many countries will have to stick to what they have and already produce, rather than to rely and depend on imports. If the outbreak lasts through the fall with a lull in the summer, there could be a financial risk if some companies go bankrupt and vulnerable countries face increased borrowing costs. Market analyst Mark Faber once said he expected the US Federal Reserve's policy to destroy the world. It is difficult to tell what will happen. I happen to believe that eventually we will have a systematic crisis and everything will collapse, he said. The coronavirus has also triggered a Saudi-Russian oil war. As the global demand for oil went down, it is natural that the prices were reduced. The global recession is expected to heavily hit oil-rich Middle East countries since the vast majority of Gulf states depend on oil exports as they never diversified their economies. Low oil prices will also affect the Russian state income, although the country officials said Russia can stand $25 per barrel for the next 6 to 10 years. According to the Foreign Policy magazine, the coronavirus crisis is a political gift for native nationalists and protectionists. Its author Philip Legrain concludes that the coronavirus crisis threatens to usher in a less globalized world. Once the pandemic and panic abate, those who believe that openness to people and products from around the world is generally a good thing will need to make the case for it in a fresh and persuasive way. In the meantime, as Harold James, Professor of History and International Affairs points out, if the pandemic does not become less contagious with the arrival of spring weather in the Northern Hemisphere, nervous populations around the world may have to wait until a vaccine is developed and rolled out. There are, however, speculations that a vaccine already exists, although it is unlikely that the only purpose of the crisis was to implement the mandatory vaccination agenda. At this point, it is hard to imagine any country benefiting from the COVID-19 pandemic, even though the United States President Donald Trump said that the coronavirus would have a very good ending for the US. Some industries, primarily pharmaceutical, will certainly generate enormous profits, but the world in general is expected to face one of its worst crises of modern times. The current global monetary, financial and trade systems will likely have to be transformed. It remains to be seen if that will mean more or less globalization. Since the pandemic is a global problem and will cause a global recession, some actors will likely push for a global solution. One thing is for sure, the world we knew is gone. The coronavirus will result in a new global order where mass consumerism and production will be heavily reduced. After all, if there hadn't been this virus, something else would have caused a radical transformation of the global system. Because energy resources are not unlimited, some countries are expected to run out of oil in the next 5 to 25 years. Others might have natural gas and oil for the next 100 years, but the level of consumption before the COVID-19 outbreak was simply unsustainable. Something had to slow it down, and that is exactly what the coronavirus did, whether it was planned or not. Thanks for watching another KJ vid. I hope you enjoyed this video and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think the coronavirus will impact the global economy and generally the geopolitical situation? Please don't forget to visit our website kjvids.co.uk, where we will be uploading fresh perspectives of the coronavirus. That's all for today, guys. We hope you stay safe, solo and strong. Thanks for watching again, and see you next time.